In the previous module, we talked about processes and using things like workflows and dialogues, and we even touched a little bit on business process flows. You know, a lot of organizations will have very specific process that they use when they're trying to perform specific tasks. So for example, you might have a situation or a process that you use for selling specific products or services that you're working with. The thing about processes is processes might be associated with one specific record within the application, but they might also start with multiple records inside the application. So for example, it might start with a lead, and then it might move to an opportunity, and then from that opportunity it might specify a specific quote, and then once that quote's been delivered, it might move to an order, and then it might move to an invoice. Regardless, each one of those situations will probably have different stages associated with them, as well as different steps that are working through it. So during that process, you want to make sure that you understand what specific tasks are going to be accomplished, because each one of those tasks may have a direct import on whether or not we win the deal within the application. So by using business process flows, companies now have the ability to actually go in and determine what needs to be accomplished during each one of those phases, define whatever that specific criteria is, and allow you to move forward. So in this module, what I want to do is really just provide you more of an overview in regards to what business processes flows are, but also start going in and looking at examining how the stages and the steps and the different categories inside a business process flow will affect when you're working through it. We're going to look at some of the different cases where you might want to go different directions based upon conditions that are met inside a business process flow. So if this takes place, now we're going to go this direction versus the other direction. We're also going to talk a little bit about how workflows can interact with business process flows and some of the options that are available with some of the newly redesigned business process flow editors that's a part of Dynamics 365. And then just look at options for triggering business process flows based upon security roles and what specific security role I might have associated with my CRM user record. What is a business process flow? So you remember we talked a little bit about in the previous module, business process flows are processes that guide users through something that's very common as part of your organization. And the nice thing about business process flows is they may span multiple Dynamics 365 records. So if you look at kind of the bottom of this slide, this is a very good example of what you would see from a business process flow perspective. Is we have a qualify stage, which means we're probably going to start with a lead, and we're going to qualify this lead into an opportunity. Once we develop, or once we've qualified this lead into an opportunity, now we're going to go into the develop phase. And during that develop phase, we're going to have specific things that we need to do to develop this opportunity to determine what specific items we want to try to sell this person on. And then we would go into like the propose stage. And now what's nice about these business process flows as part of Dynamics 365 as well is it does give you the capabilities to actually go in and look at the opportunity or look at the process itself and see how long it's been active. So if now you're starting to look at situations where things are not getting resolved as quickly as you'd hoped, or different items from that scenario, we now have kind of a ticking symbol that determines to us how long this process has been invoked within the application itself. Now what's neat about this is, as you can see within the qualify, develop, and propose stage, there's different steps that are basically in there to kind of match what the user's trying to do. So within the propose perspective, I need to identify who the sales team is and determine whether or not I've done that. I need to develop the proposal. I need to complete an internal review of that proposal, and then I need to present that proposal to the customer. So as I'm going through and marking each one of these individual things off of the list, I can actually make some of these options required, therefore saying I can't close this particular opportunity until I've completed every single one of these steps. So particularly if you're looking at it from like an onboarding process, it's nice because now I can make sure that as a new person coming into my organization, we can clearly define here's the 5, 6, or 7 different things that you need to accomplish before you can move forward with whatever it is that we're trying to do as we're kind of moving these items through. Before you can use business process flows for specific entities, you do have to enable it for the entity. So you do have to go in and define at an entity level that this entity is able to be used and participate in business process flows. And we'll show you that as part of the demo as well. Now, what happens is once you associate or say that an entity is available to be used in business process flows, every business process flow you create will start with a primary entity. So it's kind of like when we talked about workflows in the previous module. You say, okay, here's the entity that this business process flow is going to be associated with. Now, it's really just from a triggering perspective, because once the entity or once the business process flow has been triggered, that business process flow can span multiple entities within the application itself. So what's nice about that is, okay, this might start with a lead, but it can go from a lead to an opportunity to an order and so on and so forth as part of the application. Now, as these business process flows are being used and as people are executing the information in these business process flows, all of the changes that are being used are evaluated in real time. So as people are clicking on things and as people are selecting options and stages are changing, it will automatically make adjustments based upon how people are interacting with that record. So you really truly do get real-time feedback as part of the application. Now, there are out-of-the-box business process flows that ship as part of the application and are enabled by default. A lot of those are typically going to be associated with like cases and opportunities, and there's even several that are associated with the knowledge management functionality in the application. Now, there's additional business processes that you can turn on inside settings and data management. There's ready-to-use business processes that you can enable. This will turn on additional processes throughout the application. Now, once they're enabled, you can't necessarily turn off the set of business process flows, but if you ever decide that you don't necessarily want to use them, you don't have to. You can deactivate a business process flow if for whatever reason it's just not fitting your needs anymore. Now, the nice thing with Dynamics 365 is they've actually changed the business process flow editor from previous versions. So if you have experience with business process flows, this is going to look very different. Conceptually, it's still very much the same in regards to how things are structured, but in the past it used a much more text-driven editor as opposed to kind of the drag and drop editor that you'll see here. So this process window now gives you the capabilities to drag specific steps and conditions into the application so you can really get more of a dynamic flow in regards to what's taking place. So what you're seeing here is kind of the standard lead to opportunity close sales business process flow. It starts with a lead, that's going to be the qualifying stage. Then it moves to an opportunity, which is the develop stage. And then once the develop stage has been done, then it moves into a propose stage. And what I can see in here is these individual numbers and items that are associated with it. This tells me the number of steps that each one of these stages has in the application. And then this little circle option, or kind of continuous rotation circle, basically tells me any workflows that I might have associated with each one of these stages as well. And we'll get into this in much more detail here in just a couple of minutes. So what you'll see here is just an overall visual design that shows you how this business process flow is going to function inside the application. Now, from a component standpoint, there's a few different types of components that are associated with business process flows. And they're really kind of broken down into two phases. There's the flow phase and then there's the composition phase. Within the flow phase, you have your stages. And your stages are what you would consider those major or primary accomplishments within the application. I'm going to qualify this lead. I'm going to develop this opportunity. I'm going to propose this opportunity. I'm going to create my order, whatever that situation would be. There's also conditions. And so these conditions allow you to branch off into different stages based upon steps or items within the previous stage. So let me give you a good example of where you might use conditions. Maybe you're working for like an auto company and you have a business process flow that goes through, and one of the items that you evaluated in regards to that business process flow is, are they buying a new car or are they buying a used car? Well, if they're buying a new car, odds are they're going to get that 3-year, 36,000-mile warranty on that new car. If they're buying a used car, now we want to maybe send them to our kind of aftermarket scenario, and we want to try to sell them on one of our service contracts. Once we've determined whether or not they want to have a service contract, now we're going to go back into kind of the business process flow and try to determine financing just like we would do for a new car. And so this is where, from a condition standpoint, I could have it kind of veer off into a different direction based upon something something that was selected and then move back into the business process flow once we've defined how that process works. Now, within the flow, there's also what are called the compositions. And the compositions are the individual items. So a stage will have steps. And those steps are really just Dynamics 365 fields within the application. So you saw in kind of a previous scenario, did I determine who the decision maker was? Have we identified the team that's associated with this? This now gives me the capabilities to say, here are the specific fields or steps that I need to fill out as part of this business process flow. And then the other option that we have is workflows. So now when I go into a specific stage or I access a specific stage, if I want to have a workflow trigger inside the application, I would have the ability now to facilitate workflow creation based upon entering or exiting a stage as part of the business process flow. And this process is actually kind of neat because this is brand new to Dynamics 365. We didn't necessarily have workflow functionality in previous versions or iterations of the application. So let's show you just kind of some initial setup around these business process flows. So I'm going to go into settings and I'm going to actually just go into customize the system. Now normally I would probably go into a solution and just open up the existing solution based upon the entity that I'm working with. But for today's purposes, we'll just go ahead and expand out customizations and kind of go into the default solution. I'm going to click on the account entity. And when I click on the account entity, this will open up the entity definition or the entity properties for this particular item. And as we talked about in the slide itself, if you're going to use business process flows, you do have to enable the entity for business process flows. So you'll see here underneath process, it says business process flows and it says field will be created. You have to check this box to enable it. Now, once it's been checked and business process flows have been enabled, now you don't have the ability to turn business process flows off for this entity. You certainly don't have to use them, but they are now something that is enabled and that can be used for this entity moving forward. And so it's real important if you have like a custom entity or something like that that you've created that you want to use as part of this, that you go in and you enable it for business process flows and then save and publish so that information is available. Once the business process or the entity that you want to work with has been enabled, now you can go in and you can actually kind of start building your business process flow based upon what it is that you're looking for. So now I can go into settings, I can go into processes, and then inside processes, I can go ahead and define whatever type of process I want to work with. In this case, I'm going to create a new process. I'm going to call this a demo BPF. Going to make this a business process flow. And in this case, we will associate this with the lead entity. Or actually, we'll just do it with the opportunity in it. Now, you'll notice that there's an option in here that says run as a business process flow classic or run as a task flow, mobile only. There's a different option around mobile that would allow you to kind of auto stream common task creation based upon the fact that you're working on a mobile device. So now you want to create some follow-up things. Maybe there's some different items. It's conceptually very similar to a business process flow, but it's only mobile functionality. We're not going to focus too much on that for right now. We're going to focus more on just kind of the business process flow option. So we'll go ahead and choose run as a business process flow. We'll click on OK. And this is going to open up kind of that design editor that we can see. So when I come into my design editor, I can see that I have my item that I'm working with. So when I click on my opportunity option, I can see that it tells me what the stage is called. So this is where I can define what I want to call this. Maybe we'll just call this qualify. Now, in here, I can now associate this with a specific entity. Now you'll notice that I can't change anything here. The reason why I can't change anything here is because this is the first stage in this business process flow, and when we created this stage, or this business process flow, we associate it with the opportunity entity, so it has to be kind of defined from that standpoint. The category is really more from just kind of a reporting perspective. This is where if I wanted to be able to report on specific areas for these categories, this is where I could select different category options and then use it from there. Now, the other thing is these categories are really just global option sets that you could go in and you could customize to fit your specific needs based upon the different labels. So once you've kind of got the information defined in here for what you want to work with, you can hit apply and it will apply that information to the item that you're working with. Now, if I go back into components, in here now I can see the different options that I can define for how I want to move through this. Now, what you can see in here is I have kind of my mini designer. This is going to give me just kind of a flow procedure so I can see as I start adding these individual options into here what the flow of this business process flow looks like. I also have zoom in and zoom out options, so depending upon how many steps and stages I would have inside this business process flow, I may run into situations where it's just hard to see within the element of this designer, so this allows me to kind of expand and collapse things as needed. I also can take a snapshot of this, so if I ever want to see what this looks like in the grand scheme of things and kind of keep this for historical purposes, I can look through that process as I'm going through. But now these are those different components that we've talked about. And so if I look at this individual option here and I click on it, you'll see that I don't have really anything underneath details. I can see my specific steps. So these are all the steps that are associated with this particular stage. And remember that, each step constitutes a field, and we'll talk about that here in a couple of seconds. But this is where, as I wanted to add specific items, I could just drag them over and place them in the editor in the position that I want to work with. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we move through, but this is kind of the initial scenario that shows you how this editor works so you can see exactly what the options are. So let's talk a little bit more about stages, steps, and categories. So you saw kind of in the previous demo that I can add additional stages, and we'll do a little bit more of that. I can do categories to kind of better categorize that information when I'm going through. And as I mentioned, that's really more around reporting. The steps are kind of the biggest thing that I want to talk a little bit about. So as you're going through, each stage is going to have different steps that are going to define what it is that people need to do inside the application. Now, these steps are really just fields inside your Dynamics 365 implementation. So if you look at kind of over here on the side, it says, step 1 is existing contact, step 2 is existing account, purchase time frame, estimated budget. These are fields that have been added to the Dynamics 365 implementation. Like the existing contact is just the lookup field on the opportunity to an existing contact record. The existing account is just a lookup to the account entity. So you can change the label inside the business process flow, but the bottom line is these are still just fields that are coordinated with the actual application itself. And so one of the other things that you want to sometimes keep in mind is you may create a bunch of fields that are just going to be used in a business process flow and not on the actual form of the item that you're working with. That is totally acceptable. That's actually in a lot of cases recommended because you wouldn't otherwise you'd just kind of be doubling up on the information as you're working through it. Now, a couple of things that you do need to remember when you start talking about these different stages, steps, and items is a business process flow can have a maximum of 30 stages, and each one of those stages can have a maximum of 30 steps. Now, that seems like a lot, and in a lot of cases, particularly from a stage perspective, 30 stages is a lot of stages. However, when you start thinking about the steps and what people might be doing, it is sometimes easy to get through that process fairly quickly. So you may want to be looking at, if you have 30 stages or if you have more than 30 stages, are there areas where you can consolidate this? Do you need to have maybe different business process flows based upon different situation? Can branching play a factor into what you're doing? So there are some limitations in regards to how much information you can put into this as you're moving forward. The point behind business process flows is the fact that we've got multiple items that are going to span multiple entities. And so by logical standpoints, most of the business process flows that you're going to create are going to have multiple entities involved with them. Now, the only thing to really remember is you can have a maximum of 5 entities per business process flow. Now, within that context, you can have several different entities, several different stages associated with that entity, but you still can only have 5 entities per business process flow. And each stage can only be associated with one entity. Now, I can have multiple stages associated with the same entity, but each stage can only be associated with one entity. So if you look kind of down on the bottom here, we've got the qualify stage, which is associated with the lead entity. We've got the develop stage, which is associated with the opportunity entity. And same with propose, is also associated with the opportunity. That's fine as long as each stage is only attached to one entity. Now, the other situation is when you're creating these business process flows and you're moving from one entity to another, you don't necessarily have to have a relationship between the entities. There's an argument to be made for having a relationship, because if you have a relationship between the entities, now you can do things like auto-closing a previous entity. It gives you a little bit more flexibility in looping back to entities if you ever want to loop back to them, but you do have some nice functionality around those individual situations. Only entities that have business process flows enabled can actually be associated with the business process flow. And again, if you are going to leverage relationships from a business process flow standpoint, you have to be leveraging one-to-many relationships. You don't have the capabilities to do many-to-many relationships as part of your option. But again, most of what you're going to be doing as you're building these options are going to be working through and spanning through multiple entities, where you can see kind of that capabilities built into the properties here. You can see on the proposed stage that we're using the opportunity entity and we don't have a relationship with a previous entity that we've worked through. So when we start talking about business process flows and working through some of those individual situations, conditional branching is always something that happens. And we talked about that in the context of the auto scenario, where if it's a new car, we're going to do this. If it's a used car, we're going to do this. So it does give you the capabilities to associate branching with your option. The thing to remember with branching is the branching rules have to be based upon the steps in the preceding stage. So if I'm in the qualify stage or if I'm in the develop stage, and I want to go ahead and do a conditional branch, the branch has to be based upon values that were captured in that develop stage and not the qualify stage. So you have to look at that immediately preceding step to kind of work through it. When I go through those individual situations, I can specify how I want that branch to kind of delve off into that option, and I can go up to 5 levels deep within those scenarios. And it does support kind of a mixing and matching of and or options is when I'm working through it. So I can say, if this is true or this is true, do this. Or if this is true and this is true, do this. The only thing I can't necessarily do is I can't have a scenario that says, if the state is New Mexico or Pennsylvania and the estimated revenue is more than 500,000, then do this. I don't have that option. You would have to looking at your first option that says if it's New Hampshire or Pennsylvania, do this. And then your next condition says, okay, now if it's more than 50,000, do this. If it's less than 50,000, do this. You can accomplish it, but you typically need to accomplish that through different steps as far as the conditions. You can't do them all within the same condition. And we'll show you that here as an example here in just a couple of seconds. So let's now look at this with a little bit more detail now that we've kind of seen how these processes work. So here's that kind of out of the box lead to opportunity sales process. And when I expand the lead qualify stage, I can see here's my individual situation. So I can see step 1 is to determine if they're an existing contact or an account. I can look at their purchase time frame, estimated budgets, and processes associated with those options. Now, if I wanted to, I could go ahead and let's just kind of delete this option here. Now when I'm ready, I could now take a stage, I could drag it right over into my option and say, oh, from my opportunity standpoint, the next stage that we have is my close stage. So I'm going to specify this as a close stage. I can see what specific entities I want to work with. Now you can see here, being that it's an ending stage, it doesn't necessarily matter what specific opportunity or entity I associate this with. I could now pick on the opportunity I want to associate it with, and then I could come into here and I could specify if this had a relationship with a previous entity that I wanted to work with, what is that relationship that defines how that process works. Now, being that this is all tied to the same opportunity entity, it doesn't necessarily have a relationship between those individual options. Now, this is where I can start kind of building some additional functionality. So for example, if I look at the opportunity close or propose option here, and I can basically see here that I have to complete an internal review. So this is where now we could go ahead and we could define maybe some different conditions around how we want to work through this. So I could come into here now and I could add a condition to this process that says, what do I want to do within this condition? And so now I can come into here, and when I specify my condition, I could specify what the rule itself is. So what is the field that I want to evaluate based upon this different situation? So I want to look at specific fields on this option. So in this case, I wanted to basically go through and identify, let's look at my step again here real quick, complete internal review. So in this case, I'm going to look at my field. I'm going to click on Complete Internal Review, and I'm going to say if it was marked as complete, or if it was not marked as complete, what do I want to do at this point? If it's been completed, what do I want to do? So this is where I can define what specific value I want to look at from that standpoint as I'm going through. Once I've defined what that process looks like, now I can specify what needs to happen based upon that specific condition. So now I can hit Apply. And now I can go back to components, and now I could define a specific stage. And now underneath this option, I could say, okay, if this condition takes place, what am I going to do? And so now I'm going to define what happens within this stage to go through into the next option. So if it hasn't been marked as completed, or I didn't do something, now I need to go into this particular option, and I need to capture additional info. Then I could specify what specific entity this is going to be worked with. Then I could also, if I needed to, specify relationships, but this is coming from the same standpoint. So now I could add individual steps to this option to define what specifically should take place in here. But you'll notice that as I veer off, it's ultimately coming back into the same path. So even though I'm going to capture some additional info, once I've captured that info and I've marked that info as complete, now I can go ahead and hit next and move on to the final stage. So this is where if you want to veer off from kind of a conditional standpoint, you do have the capabilities to do so as part of the application. Now the other thing that you can do is as you're working through these options, I can delete specific conditions from this option. I can edit this information however I want. And what's nice about this is as I'm entering this or adding or removing this information, it kind of keeps things in line. So now that I've removed the condition, it goes right to my capture additional info. I can delete this stage from my workflow or from my business process flow and bring information back from here. Now the other thing that I can do is as I'm going through these individual options, I can see on these steps that I can also define what specific field these steps are. So these are just fields inside the application that define what's working with. If I want to make something required, I can just hit required here, and that'll make it required as part of the business process flow. It will not make it required as part of the application as a whole. So these are, again, just ways that depending upon how you want to bring the information in, people can see specifically how that process works. Again, once you've got your information in there, you just hit apply, and that'll make the apply the changes to your option. Now the other option that you have is your workflow component. And so when you add a workflow component to a specific option, down here on the workflow, I have areas that I can use to trigger when this workflow is going to function. So maybe I have a workflow that needs to manipulate some values inside a field. Maybe I have a workflow that needs to check something out as part of the application. This is where I can work with and define how I want this information to be created. And I can have it work from a stage standpoint when I enter the stage, or I can have it when I exit a stage. So right before we're exiting a stage and moving on, do I have a specific workflow that I want to trigger and function? Or right before I'm coming into a stage, do I have a specific functionality that I want to trigger or function as part of that option? So this is where I now have kind of some nice flexibility around what specific situations we want to work with. Now, the big thing to remember here is I can do workflows on kind of two tiers of options. I can do workflows at a stage-specific level if I want to, but I can also do workflows on a global level. So if I want to have workflows that might be available across the context of the entire business process flow, I can do that. The only thing you have to remember about workflows that you want to use inside business process flows is those workflows do have to be on-demand workflows. They can't be triggered based upon a specific event. They would have to be something that would be triggered on demand, and the on-demand functionality would be when somebody is coming into that stage or when somebody is exiting that stage. But again, this is something that we didn't necessarily have in previous versions of the application, so it does give you some nice ways to facilitate that as you're moving forward. Now, in this case, I'm going to just delete my workflow. We'll leave my option the way it is. I'll add a close stage to this. We'll call this close opportunity. We'll add a step to it. Step 1, we will status reason, call this, and then we will delete step 2. And now I can go ahead and save and then ultimately activate this. Now the other option that you have is the validate option. This would allow me to basically go ahead and validate this workflow if need be once I start working through all of these individual options. But in this case, we can just go ahead and we don't need to validate it because it was validated when it was saved. Now the other option that you see here are these what are called security roles. So again, you might have multiple business processes that get functioned or executed based upon who individual people are within the application. And so one of the things that you can do here is you can set up and you can say that specific business process flows are only available to specific security roles inside your organization. So now you might have a situation where you have 3 business process flows associated with the opportunity entity. One of those is associated with a salesperson security role. One of those is maybe associated with a sales manager security role. Now what it does is when somebody creates a new opportunity, it looks at who that user is and it looks at what their security role is, and based upon that option, it'll go out and that's the business process flow that it will trigger inside the application. So it takes kind of a 2-tier process. What it actually does is it looks at what security role is associated with that business process flow and what security role that specific user has, but then it also looks at this order of business process flows. And so it looks at the order that is defined, and the first specific business process flow that your security role has access to is the one that you're going to see inside the application. If you have more than one business process flow associated with a specific record, you do have the ability to change those inside the application as well. But let's just go ahead, let's activate this business process flow here real quick. Let's just give this a quick option here. There we go. Revalidate it quick. And it looks good. Save it and activate it. So now once this is activated, if I go back into the application, and I go into sales, and let's just go into opportunities, and we'll just open up an existing one here. So now if I open this up, I can see that my business process flow information is in there. I can see where we're at from the individual options. I can see what's been completed, what's not completed. I can click on individual options to mark this. If I want to, I have an option up here where I go to processes, and this is where, if I want to, I could switch this business process to a different business process. If I'm somebody who has the ability to edit this business process, I could edit this business process, or I could completely just abandon this business process depending upon what my specific needs are. So you do have some flexibility around how this process works. Now, if I switch business processes, the big thing to remember is all of the information will still be there. It'll just kind of start over at the beginning. Not a big deal. You can advance through the stages kind of as necessary, but it gives you the capabilities to kind of work through those. So now I can go to my next stage, hit my next stage, and it will advance to the next scenario. I can then see how long I was in that specific stage, and I can see that I've been in that stage for X amount of time, and then I can work with it from there. But this gives you kind of a nice scenario to see exactly what that process looks like as you're moving forward. I want to show you kind of one more piece to this. So in the previous example, we showed you how to create or work with and edit a business process flow. And remember, when we were going through and creating that business process flow, one of the options that we saw was kind of a mobile task flow or a task flow. And I want to show you where that plays into the realm of what you might be working with. So I'm going to go back in, I'm into processes. I'm going to go ahead and create a new process. And I'm going to associate this with, we'll just call this sample task flow. And I'm going to associate this with the, no, we'll just say like the opportunity entity or even just the appointment entity. We can go ahead and do that. So I have this option as run process as mobile or as task flow. What this is think about how you might do business from an application standpoint. So let me go ahead and just associate this with a phone call. And okay. So think about how you might do business when you're going through. I'm going to go through, I might create a phone call, I might call somebody specifically from a customer perspective, and once I'm done with that customer, there might be specific tasks or items that I need to facilitate as part of that. Maybe I need to go into the contact that's associated with that phone call, and I need to make some updates on information. Or maybe I need to go into a related record and be able to facilitate some type of functionality. This is where mobile task flows come into play. So if your policy as an organization is, once you've had an appointment or once you've had some type of procedural item that you're working through, when you're done, you now need to go in and update multiple entities inside the application. You can create a task flow that it can be triggered on a mobile device, that once you trigger that task flow, it gives you a step-by-step procedural, almost like a little mini wizard that says, okay, here's the information that you need to feed in. So on the phone call, you need to update this information, and then on the primary contact or the contact associated with that item, you need to update this information and individualized items as you're moving forward. So let's say, for example, I want to construct this from a phone call standpoint. So I'm going to go ahead and I can see in my details that I have different elements or different fields that can be associated with this. So I'm done with my phone call. What do I need to do? So I can click on these individual fields and I can define what needs to be updated in regards to the item that I'm going through. So for example, maybe I want to go ahead and let's call this update description. I can see that this is associated with the phone call entity. I can now go ahead and pick what field I want to work with. So in this case, I'll hit description. And then I can go ahead and define, am I requiring somebody to update that description field? So if so, I can make it required. Then I can go ahead and hit apply. Now I could go ahead and define what do I want to do next. So in this case, I'm just basically updating the phone call information. So we'll just call this update phone call. But now I could go ahead and I could add maybe a new page, so kind of the next page in the wizard. So I'm going to go from updating that phone call to now updating another specific item that I'm working with. So maybe let's call this contact info. So now when I go into my details and I look on my components, now I could come into here and I can look at my field and I can see that I can pull this from a bunch of different situations. So if this phone call was related to a specific contact, I could actually pull this in from the regarding contact. And now I could make sure that I have updated fields from that contact. So maybe I want to verify that the phone number is correct. Maybe I want to verify that the address is correct. This is where now you kind of create this mobile task flow that guides you through the process of of making sure that any entities related to whatever it is that you're trying to do at that point have been subsequently updated. Now, the nice thing about this is, being that this is feeding directly into the related records contact record, the phone number is already going to be there. The address is already going to be there. If all you're trying to do is just verify that the information is still correct, or maybe create a new task or an item that to associate it with it, that's what this is going to be able to allow you to facilitate. So if you think about, follow-up tasks that would need to happen from the concept of a mobile a meeting or an event that you would want to be able to quickly make sure people can do within the context of a mobile device, this is where mobile task flows come into play. You can associate this with one screen, but that one screen can be associated with multiple entities. So I could have information from the record itself, and then I could have information from the related records associated with that, or the parental records associated with that, to be able to facilitate that. I also could even bring in conditions. So I could say, if this takes place, if this phone call was an outgoing phone call, or if this particular situation happened on this opportunity, if this field is set to this, now fire off this page, and here's the data that I need to capture. If this is being done, now I need to fire and capture this information. So if you're trying to create supporting activities or supporting entity-based information, it gives you kind of a nice way to facilitate that. Let me show you kind of another kind of pre-created example here. So I'm going to just go ahead and leave this option, and I'm going to actually go into this business process flow, and I'm going to associate with the, let me just switch this to all processes quick, and this after meeting option. So I'm going to open this one up so you can kind of see an example to this. So here I have kind of my appointment. So the first thing that it's doing is it's verifying the appointment details from this option. So it's showing me what specific fields that I went in. I'm looking at the notes labels. I'm looking at fields from the description value, different items. Then I have a condition that basically evaluates that if this was regarding a case and the case contains data, then I'm going to go ahead and create an appointment or update the case based upon that situation. So I'm going to update the regarding case field on the appointment. Otherwise, I'll have a condition that looks to see if it's in regards to a contact or to an account. And then I would update that appointment regarding that specific account. So this is where you can look at, where did this appointment take place? What were the situations that took place around this appointment? What was this appointment regarding? Was it regarding a specific case? Was it regarding a specific contact? If so, based upon those items, now I need you to guide users through this particular methodology. So it's a great way to streamline what people might be doing within the context of the application. But again, this is something that you can create specifically targeted at mobile applications. It's a very similar process to your business process flow designer, but again, it's specifically targeted at mobile-based applications. So as you can see, business process flows really do provide kind of a great way to guide your users through any type of process that you might have that involves, one or multiple CRM records. By going through and defining different stages and processes, you now have the ability to ensure that every single user of the application is following the exact same procedures and kind of maximize what it is that you're working with. What's nice about the business process flows is there's just the flexibility. So from a conditional branching standpoint, if you're looking at, I want to go this direction based upon this option, you now have that flexibility to really drive people off, as opposed to in the past where sometimes we just had to have multiple business process flows to be able to facilitate those different business processes or procedures inside the application. Now, the other thing that's nice is within the context of these business process flows, workflows can also be added to now go in and start manipulating some of the data a little bit based upon how you're entering and exiting those individual stages. What's nice about that is now you have a little bit more flexibility to interact with other portions of the record itself and maybe fill in additional fields based upon values that have been plugged in as part of that business process flow when people are checking off and interacting those phases, which in the past we didn't necessarily always have the capabilities to do. And if you're looking for kind of a way to have flexibility around these options, security rules can be used to really process and show show those business process flows for different entities based upon who that user is. So it looks at who you are and says, okay, this is the business process flow that's really should be available to you, and it triggers that functionality individually and kind of lets you start working the information from there. So business process flows, particularly if you're trying to guide people through kind of a starting and ending procedure, business process flows are a great way to facilitate that as you're moving forward.